An Introduction to the Ethics and Regulation of Human Subject Research. I'm Warren Capell, the Director of COMIRB, the Institutional Review Board for the University of Colorado Denver and its affiliated institutions. The learning objectives for this session are two. First, to understand the three core ethical principles of human subject research, which are described in the Belmont report. Second, to understand how these core principles relate to research regulation. And third, to review the structure and function of institutional review boards, or IRBs. To understand where we are currently in the regulatory oversight of human subject research, it's important to know about some of the landmark events of the 20th century that helped shape our current regulations. Starting in the 1930s with World War II atrocities, where prisoners of concentration camps were experimented on for the sake of medical knowledge and advancing the war effort. These experiments, often resulting in torture, were carried out without subjects' consent or their full understanding of what was being done to them. Or the Tuskegee Study, in which indigent African American men with syphilis were misled into thinking they were being treated for a condition they knew as bad blood, while instead they were simply being followed to observe the natural course of the disease. This experiment continued well after penicillin had become widely available for the treatment of syphilis, allowing their disease to ravage these men and their families. Another example is the Willowbrook Study, which took place in a home for developmentally delayed children where there was a high rate of contracting hepatitis A. In this study, investigators seeking a vaccine for hepatitis A deliberately exposed children to the virus. There was an informed consent process for the parents of these children, but it was not made clear to the parents that their children would be intentionally inoculated with the virus. Some additional studies in the 1960s and 70s present examples of psychological and social harms. One example that many of you are likely familiar with, presented in many Introduction to Psychology classes, is the Milgram obedience experiment. In this experiment, subjects were asked to deliver electrical shocks of increasing intensity to a person they were led to believe was the actual subject of a learning experiment. The subject was not aware that the presumed subject of the experiment in a different room was not a participant, but instead was really an actor, feigning pain and suffering with each shock. The experiment was designed to see whether the true subject of the study would continue to increase the voltage of the shocks beyond what was labeled as a dangerous range, simply because an authority figure asked them to continue. The subjects in this study experienced intense psychological effects, thinking they had harmed the actor. Another example is the Zimbardo prisoner study, where an investigator sought to assess whether authoritative and submissive behaviors were innate or whether they would be induced under the right conditions. The investigator divided university student subjects into prisoner and prisoner guard roles to live in a makeshift prison in the basement of a lecture hall for 2 weeks. The study had to be halted after only 6 days because of abusive behaviors by the guards and significant anxiety-depression responses in the prisoners. One of the major problems with this study is that the investigator played the part of a prison warden, was not able to quickly recognize the harms being done to the prisoner subjects, and failed to stop the study in a timely fashion. Finally, the tea room trade study provides another example of social harms. In this study, the investigator posed as a lookout in public restrooms to observe men having sex with men, and later interviewed them to understand how these encounters took place, who the men were, the kinds of lives they led, and their motivations for the impersonal sexual encounters. For many of his subjects, the investigator never revealed he was doing research. He used their license plates to later track them down and interview them in the guise of a public health survey. While his study helped break down stereotypes of the men engaging in these encounters that had been resulting in their arrests, it was also criticized for its significant invasion of privacy and deception. The 1966 Beecher article in the New England Journal of Medicine had a profound effect on public demand for human research regulations. In this article, Henry Beecher published examples of multiple studies done unethically or with questionable ethics, conducted by major academic institutions and published in reputable journals. This article exposed widespread unethical practice in research that had been accepted by mainstream medical establishments. The development of human research regulations were ultimately shaped by these events. The Nuremberg Trials followed the atrocities of World War II and eventually led to the Nuremberg Code. This code of ethical research conduct outlined 10 points including the absolute essential nature of voluntary informed consent, the avoidance of unnecessary injury and suffering, and the subject's ability to halt the trial upon request. The Declaration of Helsinki followed the principles laid out in the Nuremberg Code, but also addressed the separation of clinical care from research and allowed the flexibility of informed consent to be given by a surrogate. Upon later revision, this code also expanded to include review of the research by ethics committees. These initial codes laid out an ethical framework in which to conduct research, but they were voluntary and unenforced. It wasn't until later, in the 1970s, with the publication of the Beecher article and the exposure of the Tuskegee experiment, that there was widespread public demand in this country for laws regulating human research. In 1974, the National Research Act was passed, establishing the Belmont Commission to identify core principles by which ethical research is conducted. These principles, which we will review shortly, were laid out in the Belmont Report, which formed the foundation for the regulations that govern human subject research today, 45 CFR 46, otherwise known as the Common Rule. One of the requirements specified in the Common Rule is that an Institutional Review Board, or IRB, review all federally funded research. An IRB is a committee that reviews research proposals to make sure they are being conducted ethically and according to the regulations. At the University of Colorado, Denver, the Common Rule regulations are applied to all research, not only federally funded research. The IRB at the University of Colorado, Denver, and its affiliated institutions is known as COMIRB, the Colorado Multiple Institutional Review Board. COMIRB is comprised of 5 fully functioning IRBs, or panels, that have different expertise to review the wide range of research at our institution. There are 2 panels, Panels A and B, devoted to reviewing general adult research. Panel C is devoted to reviewing pediatric research. Panel D reviews oncology and other high-risk research. And Panel S reviews exclusively social and behavioral research. Let's take a look at the composition of each one of these IRB panels. Each IRB panel at the University of Colorado, Denver has 9 members. The members must not all have the same gender or profession. A minimum of 5 voting members must be present at any meeting for a quorum to exist. At least 1 member must have a scientific background, and at least 1 member must have a non-scientific background. At least 1 member of the IRB must also have no affiliation with the University of Colorado, Denver. This diversity in voting members is required by the regulations to ensure that different perspectives are present to contribute to the review of the research. Each panel discusses research proposals to ensure they agree the research is being conducted in accordance with the Common Rule and with the ethical principles of the Belmont Report. The Belmont Report describes 3 core ethical principles that must be followed in all human research. The first is respect for persons, the idea that participants are treated with the full measure of respect and dignity as autonomous agents to decide for themselves whether they want to participate in a research study and when to stop their participation. Respect for persons dictates that participants have all necessary information available to allow them to make these decisions. This principle also directs that individuals that lack the ability to make a free, autonomous decision, such as newborns, children, prisoners, or people with impaired cognitive function, have additional protections. The second is the principle of beneficence. Beneficence is acts of kindness that go beyond strict obligation. This principle dictates that participants are not put at unnecessary risk from the research, that the risks of the research to the participants are minimized, and that the benefits of the research, whether to the subject or to society, outweigh those risks. And finally, the principle of justice, which dictates that there is an equitable distribution of both the benefits and risks of the research. The individuals participating will be from the same groups or populations that will ultimately benefit from the research findings. Included in this concept is that recruitment of subjects for the study will be equitable and will not exploit populations that are merely easily accessible. The Common Rule specifies 8 criteria that must be satisfied in order for a research study to be approved. The IRB must determine that the risks to subjects have been adequately minimized. Second, that the risks of the research are reasonable in relation to the anticipated benefits, in terms of personal benefits to the subjects or the benefits to society from the knowledge that will be obtained in conducting the research. Third, that the selection of subjects in the study is equitable. Fourth, that informed consent is appropriately sought from subjects. Fifth, that informed consent of the subjects is adequately documented as appropriate. And when appropriate, some additional measures. That the study is appropriately monitored as it is conducted to ensure that there are no unanticipated risks and that the safety of the subjects is preserved. That privacy and confidentiality of the subjects is adequately protected. And finally, that there are additional safeguards for subjects who are vulnerable to pressures for joining a study, such as those with limited autonomy in making their own decisions and those that may experience additional pressures to join a study. Remember that all of these criteria derive from the ethical principles of the Belmont Report. Let's look more closely at how these criteria relate to the underlying Belmont principles. What about these criteria? That risks are minimized, that benefits outweigh risks, that the study is monitored to ensure subject safety, and that subjects' privacy and confidentiality are protected. What's the underlying ethical principle here? Beneficence. These criteria seek to ensure that subjects are maximally protected from harms and that this commitment does not end once they enter the study. Beneficence directs that subjects are not merely used as a means to an end. What exactly do we mean with the idea of risk? Many of us initially think of risk as the magnitude of harm that can occur, but the term risk takes into account both the magnitude of harm as well as the probability that a harm will occur. When assessing the risks of a research study, both must be taken into account. A very serious harm may pose little actual risk if the chances it will occur are very low. What about these criteria for approval? That selection of subjects is equitable and that additional safeguards are included for vulnerable populations. What's the underlying ethical principle here? Justice. The recruitment and selection of subjects is such that those participating stand to benefit from the research and that no group is unfairly targeted out of convenience. What about these criteria for approval? That informed consent is sought and documented, that privacy and confidentiality are protected, and that additional safeguards are included for vulnerable populations. What's the underlying ethical principle here? Respect for persons. These criteria all help to ensure that each participant is able to make their own informed decision about their participation and that each has reasonable control over his or her information. Let's talk a little about informed consent in research. Through all codes and regulations, voluntary informed consent is crucial, the key word being voluntary. That each subject has enough information to know exactly what they are being asked to do and the risks he or she will be exposed to when volunteering to join a study. Under the common rule, there are certain situations that would allow the inclusion of individuals in research without their consent. For example, another person with the legal authority or a family member can sometimes make the decision on behalf of the subjects. With some types of research that pose extremely low risk to subjects, the requirement for informed consent can be waived altogether under the common rule. It's also important to remember that informed consent is not just the signing of a piece of paper, it's a process. Informed consent is an ongoing process of exchanging information between the investigator and the subject to make sure the subject understands fully what will occur and what is occurring in a research study. With continued interactive exchange of information, an investigator can ensure that the subject's decision is informed and voluntary. A research subject must be informed of the following things to make sure the subject is making an autonomous decision. First, the risks and anticipated benefits of the research. Second, what alternatives to research participation she or he may have, which is particularly important when the research involves a potential medical treatment. And finally, their rights as a participant, the right to voluntarily withdraw at any time without penalty, the right to have all new information that may affect their decision to continue in the study provided to them, and the right that their information will be appropriately safeguarded. In order to ensure informed consent is truly voluntary, it's important that the subject be in a setting free of pressures to join the study. One thing to be especially wary of is a provider-patient relationship. Patients put a great deal of trust in their providers and also may not want to disappoint a provider who's conducting a study. IRBs play a vital role in helping to promote ethical research through their review of proposed research. IRBs provide an objective assessment to the research plan by members with both scientific and non-scientific perspectives. They help to protect subjects' rights and interests. They help to protect subjects' safety in the research, and they help to ensure fairness in the exposure of subjects to risk. But it's important to remember that an IRB-approved study is not the same as an ethically conducted study. The ethical conduct of research begins and ends with the knowledge, expertise, ability, and commitment of the investigators and members of the research team to carry out the study in an ethical manner, and in a way that will promote the public's trust in the research enterprise. When reviewing and conducting research, we use the federal regulations as a guide. It's important to remember that the regulations are the floor. They are not the ceiling. In other words, they provide an ethical foundation for us to build upon, but not an imperative that we strive to reach. We may have ethical concerns that go above and beyond the regulations. In the coming days, you will be participating in a mock IRB exercise in which you will review an actual research protocol. In that session, you will be applying the principles we have discussed in this module. Going into that exercise, I'd like you to have some questions in mind. Is the threshold for risk different when subjects are healthy volunteers? Are the risks of the research minimized? What are the benefits of the research and how are they measured? Do they outweigh the risks? How are subjects protected in the study? How does informed consent play into their protection? And finally, should subjects be compensated? If so, what's reasonable? I hope you now have a better appreciation for what IRBs do and the ethics and regulations that govern research. The COMIRB website has a lot of information about the IRB with links to guidance documents and forms used by the IRB. If you're involved with human research, the COMIRB website has a step-by-step instruction guide to help you develop your submissions. COMIRB also holds regular office hours to provide individual guidance to investigators submitting to the IRB. Check our website for days, times, and locations. The Clinical Research Support Center also offers guidance in one-on-one consultations to investigators who need additional and detailed assistance. A link to this support center can also be found on COMIRB's website.